Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm so pleased that you're with us today. My name is Lydia Zeininger. I am the director of the Ukrainian Institute of America, an institution that for nearly 80 years has stood at the heart of cultural life in New York City, preserving and celebrating Ukrainian culture and heritage. Ever since the first anniversary of the full-scale invasion, we start each of our programs with a collective reflection in tribute to the lives lost in this war and to honor the countless sacrifices Ukrainians continue to make each day in defense of their freedom and identity, not only on the front lines, but in daily acts of courage and perseverance. So I ask you to stand for a moment and join me for a brief reflection. Thank you so much. Today on Earth Day, we gather to celebrate the natural beauty of Ukraine. Its forests, wetlands, open steppes, mountain ranges, all its flora and fauna. But we also draw attention to what is being lost. We're very proud to present you with an impressive group of experts today who will discuss the devastating impacts and implications of the war in Ukraine on its ecosystems. And while we celebrate nature this afternoon with recordings of birdsong and forest breezes from Ukraine, an information hub, and a pop-up shop in the center room, please visit, we're also sounding an alarm. The war has scarred Ukrainian landscapes in ways that we are only beginning to understand. Forests burned, soils poisoned, rivers tainted, habitats destroyed, species lost. While you are here at the UIA, please take time to have a look at the photographs on display throughout this floor. These images were captured by the talented and courageous photojournalist Denis Krivy for National Geographic magazine. They show the breathtaking vistas and vibrant ecosystems of Ukraine and remind us what is at stake. I'm very grateful to our friends at Ukrainian Jersey City, many of whom are here today and who are an integral part of this program. Their creativity and enthusiasm is on display everywhere on this floor. I'm very grateful to them. I would like to introduce Oksana Kandin and Roxolana Karmazin to tell you just a bit about our Earth Month Nature and Danger project here at the UIA, a multifaceted project. Yes, let's welcome them.
Thank you so much, Lydia. Thank you to Ukrainian Institute for having us over here today, for helping us and partnering with us to organize this very important discussion. My name is Oksana Kandin. I'm a president of Ukrainian Jersey City. And this is Roxolana Karmazin, who is our arts and culture director at Ukrainian Jersey City, and she is lead for this Nature and Danger project together with me. In Ukrainian Jersey City, we deeply care for nature, and we couldn't not see what is occurring right now on the lands of Ukraine. Over a year ago, we received beautiful photographs that was donated to us by a widow, Helena Volhina, and it was photographs of Denis Krivy that you see here on the walls today. This gallery will be featured here until June 1st. All of the photographs are for sale, and the proceeds from them will go on restoring the nature. They will be going towards educating people on how to use the equipment and repair the equipment to restore the nature. And so please pick some beautiful photographs. And it's just very important for us to showcase on what is happening to our atmosphere, what is happening to rivers, and how it impacts not only Ukraine, but also the world around us, you know, the food security and so on, because Ukraine has the richest soil, and it's so important for us to preserve and restore this right now, because the impact is grand, and it will take so much more time, and there's no time like present. I'm very thankful for all of the panelists and moderators that are with us today. I really am grateful for all of you to take this time to be here and to talk your knowledge, and thank you for that. I also wanted to thank our sponsors. I have to read this one. It's a Self-Reliance New York Federal Credit Union, Ukrainian National Federal Credit Union, Interwoman Ventures, WASCOP Foundation, the Hamilton Park Group, Speed Pro, thank you so much for them, for printing all of our beautiful photographs, and Location Map that was made by Mykola and Bohdan. Thank you to Costco, the Fairway, we got the gift card from them, Hudson Hound, Canopy Hotel, and Ala, thank you so much for your floral arrangements. They're just beautiful, and we feel the immersive experience with this. I also would like to thank Natalia Ravko for providing sounds. Those are the sounds that were collected in Ukraine, and we have some in the headset and also featured in another room where you can hear. They are. It's a London project, and she has given it to us. And most importantly, I want to thank all of our volunteers, all of the people who made this possible. We have like 40 people who have been working on this project to make it happen. And this is already our third event. One took place in Washington, D.C. One took place on April 6th, where we were presenting the photographs and Dennis's work. And this, the most important event today. So I really am grateful for all of you, and thank you so much. And
we wanted to also thank our partner, the Ukrainian Institute of America. Lydia, thank you so much for working on this project, very important project here on Earth Day. We have a little something for the Ukrainian Institute of America. I did want to say that Dennis, this is actually a self-portrait of Dennis Krives. He took quite a few of these self-portraits of himself where he would center himself in the photo and use himself as the center point for taking the photo. So thank you so much, Lydia.
This is so beautiful. Landscape transformation.
Landscape transformation.
So I want to talk now about our program, which I'm going to modify because we were going to show a brief video, a 9-minute video now that frames the discussion. It's from Dr. Eugene Stachiv, who was going to be here in person with us today, but who had back surgery, and his doctor said that he really should not get it on Amtrak. He is a Ukrainian American specialist in water systems. He was part of a team of engineers who got the Nobel Prize recently, so we're very proud of him. I think what we'll do is during coffee break, we'll just put that on the screen here for anyone that wants to grab a coffee and come and have a look, because it's really comprehensive. He has a lot of statistics and interesting information. But now we'll move on, because we have a few people in Ukraine on Zoom who are going to be joining our 2 sessions. Sadly, Chris Watley had to stay in Washington for meetings at the State Department, so he will not be here in person with us. He's going to join session 2 via Zoom later on. So I think what I will do now is just hand the floor over to the moderator of our first session, Oleksandr Kukurudza of Ukrainian Jersey City.
So thanks everyone for coming this afternoon. My name is Oleksandr Kukurudza. I'm a 30-plus year management consultant, Ukrainian American, and overall Ukraine advocate. And I'll be moderating this first panel, which is about scarred lands, the war's impact on Ukraine's environment. We have brought together 4 incredible panelists and experts to speak with us on this topic for the next hour. They'll be covering the following topics of, the first one is mapping the war's impacts on the Ukrainian environment. The second topic will be focused on what's happened in areas that are protected, like Chernobyl and other protected zones. Our third topic of discussion will be around the consequences of the war on Ukraine's forests and animals. And our fourth topic will be on the Black Sea and protecting the Black Sea's environment. I've asked each panelist to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes on their topic. I'd like to save the questions until the end. We'll make sure that we have a good amount of time at the end of this panel to be able to cover questions, and we'll get into that at that point in time. But for right now, I'd like to hand it off to our first panelist, and that's Dr. Corey Scher.
It's a pleasure to be here, albeit unfortunate circumstance, but my name's Corey. I did my Ph.D., a significant amount of my Ph.D. research, trying to figure out how to map damage to buildings across the country as a result of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So the result of that work led to an estimate of all the built-up area that was damaged, and we worked very hard to make it a conservative estimate so that it wasn't inflating or adding too many false alarms. So I took research from geophysics and methods that have been developed through applications to map damage after earthquakes and translated those methods and adapted them to be able to scale over space and over time in Ukraine, such that we could use indicators from satellite radar constellations to track destabilization that happened to Ukraine's built-up areas during the war. So the long story short is that we mapped, with my colleague Jamin Vandenhoek, who I'm now doing a postdoc with, based at Oregon State University, we mapped about 300 kilometers squared of damage to built-up areas, which would be Manhattan being bombed 5 times over. And we think that that's only accounting for 50 or 60% of the total damage, based on our comparison with some spot checks of higher resolution data that were produced by the United Nations. So these data were featured in a big spread last summer at the New York Times called "What Ukraine Has Lost." It was like a interactive kind of mapping piece. So I invite you to kind of check that out if you want to see the narrative and the visuals that came with it. And if you want to get really in the weeds, I have a peer-reviewed manuscript that details all of the methods that we just published also. But my contribution, I guess, to this panel is just that the environment is also built, and cities, and we live intertwined within ecosystems, and a damaged building is a proxy for so many damages to environment and memory, right? But starting with this base level of what has been damaged and where can help us characterize things like where rubble and debris are that need to be moved and cleaned up, where there's potential pollution from, for example, like chemical manufacturing facilities that have been hit, or energy infrastructure. So a map of damage to buildings is a building block to understand all of these kind of cascading or follow-on impacts from the invasion. I don't know, without visuals, I don't know much more to say right now, but maybe I will pass to my colleagues here and we'll just continue the discussion if that sounds good.
Sure.
Thanks, everyone.
Next, I wanted to pass along the next talk to Oleksandr Borsuk, who's on Zoom for us. Oleksandr, take it away.
Hello everyone, my pleasure to be here. My name is Oleksandr Borsuk. I'm Ph.D. in silviculture and forest management, and I work currently as Deputy Head of Science Department at Chornobyl Radiation and Ecological Biosphere Reserve. The full-scale invasion of Russia Federation into the territory of Ukraine in 2022 has significant impact on environment of Ukraine. There is a destruction of forests, natural habitats, biodiversity, pollution of soils, rivers. However, assessing the damage caused by to the environment is quite difficult because there are still no clear approaches to such an assessment. And in my short report, I want to pay attention to the damage caused to the protected areas as the centers of the nature and biodiversity protection, and also to exclusion zone as I work there. Let me start with some numbers. According to the official data of Ministry of Environmental Protection and Natural Resources of Ukraine, as a result of Russian armed aggression, around 812 protected areas of the Nature Reserve Fund with a total area of 0.9 million hectares have been affected. 2.9 million hectares of the Emerald Network territories are under threat of destruction. These are the 160 territories that are part of the European Protected Areas Network and protected within the framework of the Council of Europe legislations. Around 17 wetlands of international importance are at risk, which are protected by the Ramsar Convention and received this status due to the unique biodiversity. Habitats of flora and fauna species listed in the Red Book of Ukraine, the European Red List of species and animals and plants that are under threat of extinctions on global scale have been damaged. In some protected areas, we have up to 80% of territories are burned by the wildfires. What is the main consequence of military action for nature conservation areas? There are both immediate and long-term environmental impacts that disturb the functioning of the areas and their management. Immediate impacts include the damage to the vegetation and soil cover because of the shelling, bombing, and the creation of fortifications. Long-term impacts include some effects which will be observed over the long period of time, such as mining of the territory, chemical contamination, etc. Among the consequences for the protected areas, the following can be listed. First of all is increase in number of big wildfires. It's a disturbance of the fertile soil layer, illegal logging, some damage to the population of rare species, poaching of wildlife, landmines and unexploded ordnance contamination, chemical contamination, pollution of territories by waste and remnants of military equipment, and also the damages to the ecosystem services. This list was created by the study of the impact of warfare to the occupation to the territory of the Chornobyl reserve, but the same consequences are inherent to all protected areas of Ukraine. And what can be this lead to? It's first of all, it's a change of biological and landscape diversity. Some valuable habitats are destroyed. The structure of forests and land cover in general is changing. The greatest damage is caused to the vegetation, some small mammals, reptiles, and insects, because large animals can escape, which causes the redistribution of the density within the territory. Usually, large animals such as deer or elk seek the refuge in safer regions. But there are individual cases that large animals dying on mines, barbed wire used to create fortifications, but such cases are rare and they don't have a significant impact on the animal population. But we have also some indirect consequences for the protected areas. First of all is the reduction of the management capacity. This caused because of the contaminations of the territory by unexploded ordnance and landmines, shelling in the border areas, and some military operation. It usually leads to absence or significant restrictions to the access to the territory, and the inability to carry out environmental protection and fire prevention measures. For example, to perform the task explained of my institution, Chernobyl Radiation and Ecological Biosphere Reserve, have access to about 50-60% of the territory. In the event of wildfires, we need a demining team that must be present to check the territory before the movement of the fire trucks and some equipment. Each significantly slows down the suppression of fires and contributes to their spread over the large areas. This creates the prerequisite for the destruction of biological diversity and increase in radiation risk for the personnel involved in firefighting. As the for impacts for the warfare to the radiation state of the exclusion zone, it is currently minimal, apart from some damage to the sarcophagus over the post power unit of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, but no radionuclides were moved out of the exclusion zone, or we don't have any significant emissions into the atmosphere that exceed the permissible levels. However, attacks on the radiation facilities and storage facilities can have some unpredictable consequences. So in general, the war has quite significant negative effect on the protected areas, biodiversity, habitats, and it will be lead for a long time, even after the end of the war. As Oksana says, that my colleagues will before tell about the influence of war on the other type of land cover. So I pass the floor to the next speaker. It should be Kelvin Norman.
Oh, there we go. Now we're on. So hi there, folks. My name is Kelvin Norman. I'm an assistant teaching professor of forestry at Penn State. So I'm just going to be introducing and kind of speaking a little bit about the history of forests in Ukraine and just kind of catching us up on that. So Ukraine is mostly a country of steppe. There are forests in Ukraine, about 9.2 million hectares of forest, or like 18 million acres of forest. So if you look at the entire country of Ukraine, it has about the same forest cover as the state of New York, almost as much as Pennsylvania. Unfortunately for Ukraine, no offense, but most of the forests in Ukraine are Scotch pine, which is a tree that I'm not a huge fan of. So many of the forests in Ukraine are artificially planted. They've been planted in areas that have historically not been forested. You know, it was an effort to reclaim and, you know, to shape some of the steppe into forest land. So they're planted heavily with Scotch pine. A lot of the Carpathian Mountains are still in their natural oak habitat. However, there's been a lot of planting done. This, you know, has its benefits and it has its downsides. Unfortunately, the Scotch pine has not adapted well to climate change, and it has definitely not adapted well to the damage done by the war. There's been some recent reporting from colleagues at the Fire Center. The Regional Eastern European Fire Monitoring Center. It's a really long acronym, and they estimate that 80% of forests within 50 kilometers of a front line have been destroyed. Most of the destruction is focused on the plantation Scotch pine, or Pinus sylvestris, which is, you know, terrible. It's a really tough time to be a tree, definitely east of Kharkiv. There are estimates putting the forest lost in the Luhansk region at between 70 and 90%. Much of that is from the war, as, you know, direct, you know, bombardments and fires, as well as from logging that has occurred as part of it. You know, if you want to build a trench, you need boards in there, and where do you get boards? You don't go to Home Depot. You just cut down the forest around you and mill them up on the site. So there's been a huge forest loss. Not everything is to be lost. There is definitely room for things to come back. Brian will discuss that in a little bit. I will say that I'm also very concerned about the future of these forests. When you lose and damage forests, they can come back. You can bring them back if you work on them. However, it's difficult to work on forests that have landmines in them, that have artillery shells in trees. You can't really, there's a lot of work that has to be done before you can restore them. It also opens them up for attack from invasive species. And so, instead of coming back into that natural forest, now you have non-native species that will be almost impossible to remove, that require decades of management. physical management, herbicide application, all kinds of work to get those out. So these, once you damage this forest, you can bring it back. It just takes a lot of time, work, and effort. And unfortunately, there's a lot of other demands on resources. So I'm concerned about the long-term impact of this. A couple other things I'd like to highlight is the impact on wildlife species. So Ukraine was home to several Przewalski's horses, which is an critically endangered horse species. Unfortunately, several of them have been lost over the course of the war, stepping on landmines. They're big animals, so they do set off landmines. Ukraine had been targeted for introduction of some new populations of Przewalski's horse. Unfortunately, all of that is on hold right now. Additional introductions of the horse into Russia have also been put on hold, also as a result of the war. So I just wanted to highlight just one species out of many that have been impacted. Ukraine is also an important migratory path for the bee eater. There's a fantastic photo in the other room. I actually bought one into my office. It's an important migratory stop point for the bee eater on its migration from Africa through Europe. And much of that migration has been stopped, because the migration has been interrupted because the birds can't perch anywhere. They're birds. If you destroy the trees that they like to perch out of, you destroy the cliffs that they nest in, they don't live there. When birds don't live there, they die. So the impacts of this war are going to be, they're very long. Unfortunately, they're not well studied because it's difficult to study wildlife behavior and movement at a time of war. It's not anyone's fault. It's just not easy to do. So there's a lot of questions that we have that will be unanswerable at this time, and probably unanswerable at all, just because you can't count things that have been obliterated. So there's a lot of questions, a lot of damage, some which can be remediated, some which cannot be remediated. Also, I'll save my comments about soil damage or water damage for later, but there's a lot of issues that are happening to soil and water which also cannot be remediated fully. So lots to be concerned about and to think about, but we'll put that aside.
Sure. How's this sound? All right. Okay, fantastic. Okay. All right. So to start, just thanks so much to the Ukrainian Institute of America and Ukrainian Jersey City for hosting this event. I got here way too early and got to see everyone buzzing around the room, setting up this wonderful exhibition and the chairs and everything else. And so we owe them our thanks. My name is Taylor Zaitchik. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Harriman Institute, which is Columbia University's Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. By training, I'm a historian, and I'm currently writing a history of the Black Sea region from the 1930s to the present. And what I'm most interested in is how have the different countries in the region cooperated or competed to, say, manage environmental problems and the resources of the Black Sea. So that's where I'm coming from. So we heard from Corey on urban infrastructure, and Calvin on forests, and Oleksandr on nature preserves, and so I bring us to the coasts. My job is to talk about the Black Sea. And I'll give 3 main points. This is a broad overview, and if you have questions, we can, of course, talk about that. So the first category of damage that the Black Sea has sustained, I would attribute to naval warfare. And so this was the fiercest in the early months of the conflict. Right? Naval mines, we're going to hear a lot about land mines, but naval mines were also a chief culprit. Both navies laid them, and some of them come unmoored, tragically killing beachgoers, animals, and they've been found on shipping lanes. So Bulgaria, Romania, and Turkey have recently signed an agreement to try to track down these naval mines, and over the next 5 years, hopefully remove all 400 of them. That's where we're at today. Naval operations have also threatened the sea in less direct ways. So most notoriously, about 3 years ago, we saw lots of reports about dolphins washing up dead on the shores of the Black Sea. Right? Thankfully, the initial reports that this might be 50,000 or more dolphins, which, if you know anything about the population, is maybe about a quarter to third. These are probably overblown. Those numbers don't really seem to be validated. But it does appear that the war has pushed vulnerable aquatic animals over the edge. So in the Caspian Sea, for example, at the same time, there are about 2,500 seal carcasses washed up due to, in theory, perhaps the increased naval traffic in the region and the firing of missiles. This is also a launch pad in the conflict. So the second category I'll mention is the pollution that's been caused by the assault on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. So according to Kyiv, the Russian military has destroyed something like 750 water treatment facilities. And this means that water that would otherwise be treated is now being dumped into the Black Sea watershed more or less unprocessed, right, and making its way into the water. But the biggest blow in this category, of course, is the destruction of the Novokakhovka Dam, which hit headlines in June 2023. And the blast sent 18 cubic kilometers, a lot of water, of reservoir water, down the Dnipro River into the delta, bringing up sediment across most of the northwestern section of the Black Sea and creating algal blooms and this kind of thing. So we'll see a lot of pollution. And Kyiv has estimated the damage at around $14 billion, about half of which they attribute to damage to local ecosystems. This is something to keep on your radar. The third category, this is the least mentioned, and in my opinion, perhaps the most important, and that's the disruption to the international management of the Black Sea and its natural systems. So geopolitically, the Black Sea has never been a great place for cooperation, right? The Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire were at each other's throats for many centuries. The last century was also not a great one for cooperation. The Cold War famously split the region with the socialists in the north and NATO, Turkey in the south. So for this reason, it was really the fall of communism in the late 1980s, early 1990s that created an unprecedented moment for exchange. So the newly independent socialist states, as well as Turkey, they signed all kinds of accords, created multilateral institutions, focused on things like scientific exchange and environmental management. And this really didn't come a moment too soon, because at this time, the Black Sea as an enclosed sea was a kind of poster child for problems you see elsewhere. So pollution, invasive species, we can talk more about this. But unfortunately, since the annexation of Crimea in 2014, most of these organizations have broken down. So for example, Kyiv retaliated to the annexation by failing to approve the budget for the Istanbul Commission, which monitors environmental pollution, right, and tries to coordinate issues on that. And not surprisingly, the full-scale invasion has made this climate even worse. So the Kremlin, by invading Ukraine, has made itself a pariah on the international stage. And so not long ago, the European Commission, for example, suspended Russian participation in what it calls the Black Sea Synergy Initiative, which funds environmental studies, as well as programs on fisheries and infrastructure. This, of course, is more than a Black Sea story. So the Arctic Council in a different part of the world has done more or less the same thing. And at home, the Putin regime has chased out green organizations such as the World Wildlife Fund, Greenpeace, as well as domestic organizations. So no matter what happens, it's a safe bet that Russia's evacuation from these kind of initiatives and standards will have long-term consequences. So you probably saw in December that 2 Russian tankers sank off the Kerch Straits, releasing many thousands of tons of mazut, a kind of heating oil, into the sea. And while this disaster wasn't caused by the war per se, it does suggest the extent to which sanctions busting and the breakdowns in an international order are going to have their consequences, create new risks and hamstring attempts to find solutions. So each of these categories, I think, naval warfare, damaged infrastructure, broken international ties, points towards one conclusion, which is that the Black Sea is being affected by the conflict. This is, of course, sobering, perhaps depressing, but I would say that as a historian, people have lived and sustained themselves in the Black Sea for a long time, and the region and its environments have shown a tremendous amount of resilience. And even in the worst times, people have found the ability to create solidarities across borders. And with that, I'll hand it to Oksana. Thank you.
Thank you, Taylor. I appreciate that. Those were pretty short, so we have the rest of the time for a Q&A. And I was thinking, since we don't have a lot of mics, maybe I'll just kind of move around as people have questions. So if you do have a question, think about whom you would like to address the question to. It could be to a specific panelist, it could be to any or all the panelists, and then ask your question. And then I'll just come around to and hand you the mic. Anyone? Feel free to raise your hand. Okay, I'll get you first.
I have a question for Taylor. With the new German Prime Minister talking a lot about potentially giving tourist missiles finally to Ukraine, there's a lot of conjecture that the Kerch Bridge will be finally destroyed. I know that this is very significant, like the bridge is very significant historically, I'm sure, And I'm wondering if there's also some, there's some significance in the Black Sea, some maybe ecological significance to this. So I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit about the significance of the Kerch Bridge and what the destruction of it might mean for the Black Sea region.
Sure, I'll venture a guess. So I'm a historian. I'm not a military analysis or an engineer, but I'll do my best. And so people have talked about building some kind of bridge across the Kerch Strait for a long time. I think back to the 19th century. Just like there were proposals for the Danube Black Sea Canal, people threw out these big projects. The Soviets created a temporary bridge that ended up being destroyed by, I think, ice flows through the Azov Sea. And then, of course, Putin came along and said, well, these past attempts existed, but we succeeded, and we connected the Crimean Peninsula to the rest of Russia. This, of course, being very important in order for them to have maintain access. It's also symbolic, right? And so Ukraine has famously made several attempts on the Kerch Bridge. The environmental implications of its destruction, I don't think would be great, just like the sinking of anything into the water. But as far as, I think a bridge's footprint, no pun intended, is fairly small in that respect. But it's maintained the connection between Crimea and the rest of, the Russian Federation. But it's not like a greenway. It's not being used by animals. It doesn't really have an ecological impact in that respect.
Hi, here's one for Corey. Fascinating stuff. I'm wondering if some of your data sets, I'm thinking in particular the one of damaged buildings, are publicly available, or if not, do you have plans to make them so?
Yeah, thanks for that question. We make our data available to journalistic and humanitarian orgs. So people and organizations who are using our data include a nonprofit called Insulate Ukraine, which is replacing broken windows with like a plastic two-ply sheeting, because kind of the conventional way that broken windows have been replaced is with plywood, and that leaves people missing light. So our data have been used to come up with estimates of the number of broken windows, for example. My collaborators and I are careful about just posting data, and what we do is invite requests.
Yeah. I imagine there are some security concerns.
Yeah, so we try and be quite sensitive with that, but we consider them open for journalistic and humanitarian orgs working on the ground, or working on characterizing the environmental impact. So another organization who's been using our data a lot is the Conflict and Environment Observatory, based in the UK, which is compiling a database of environmental harms relevant to our discussions today. But yeah, thanks for that question. It's always kind of a tricky balance, and yeah, one that we tread carefully. Thank you.
First of all, thank you for doing your work. My question is, I'm not sure who can answer it, but I come from Donbass, so I'm thinking about all the mines that are abandoned, the water is not being remediated. I wonder if Donbass now has become this kind of leaching environmental disaster, we can't access it, and how does it affect the rest of Ukraine?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question for our next panel. So
Okay.
we'll put some we'll answer some of it, and then we'll let you guys handle the rest of it. How's that sound? You guys all right with that? Okay. All right. They're gonna dig all into that, but we'll get it a little bit. So a lot of the mines have, especially some of the more anti-personnel mines, have very strong acids in them. Brian had a thought.
I think she means the coal mines.
Oh, the coal mines. Different mines. Oh yeah, of course. Different mines.
You want to take credit?
Sure. I think I'm more interested to hear what Corey has to say, but yeah. So if you look at the heat maps, even during Soviet period or before, of pollution in the Russian Empire, back when Donetsk was still Yuzovka, right? And then throughout the Soviet period, this is really one of the hotspots for water pollution in the Soviet period. It's probably the worst water quality in the entire Union. And so Ukraine, of course, inherited this lot of heavy metal. It continues to be an issue, right? What do you do with the heavy metals and the mining tailings that continue to dump into the sea? And so the war is not making this any better, right? Especially as mines have been intentionally destroyed and intentionally filled with water in order to put them out of commission. And that creates a possibility for future contamination and future problems for when peace arrives.
Great question. Okay, so I am trained in geology and geophysics, and I use satellite radar technologies to measure very subtle changes in the structure of the Earth's surface. What happened in the Donbass beginning in 2014 was cessation of dewatering activities at these coal mines. So they were removing water continually to keep the mines from flooding and pressure from building in the shaft. You're nodding because you're aware. But from the vantage point of satellite radar, when those dewatering activities stopped, pressure in the mine shaft started building, and that's pushing up the surface of the Earth on millimeter or centimeter scales in some cases, which is a prelude to an eventual large-scale toxic release of mine waters. So there's been some work tracking that risk with satellite radar data, and it's a consequence of those dewatering activities stopping. Sorry.
That's even worse than I thought.
That one's particular. I mean, it's all bad, but yeah, that's happening. It's called heave and subsidence. So heave is the phenomenon of a mine, land above a mine being forced up as pressure within the shaft is building. And you'll see subsidence signals, kind of sinking signals around that. So it's kind of like a lesion or like a wound kind of beginning to fester.
Thank you, everybody, for your presentations. I have a question for Oleksandr. So in America, about 100 years ago, they protected a lot of the national parks, which are now kind of being threatened by the current administration. I'm just thinking in terms of in Ukraine, which preserved area or protected areas are most endangered right now? Could you just say a few words about, you mentioned, I think, Chornobyl a little bit, but other areas which are the most endangered?
The most endangered areas are exactly on the front lines, I think, because there is no management, there is shellings, burnings, a lot of wildfires in these territories, and as I mentioned in my short report, that some areas are burned down up to 80%. So in that territories, we don't have anything that was before the war. And we don't have any information about the territories that are under the occupation. Some of national parks are under occupation since 2014. There is quite bad signals from some parks, Biosphere reserve like Askania Nova. It's one of the oldest in Ukraine. There is a lot of animals. There is a lot of rare species in this territory, and we have some information that Russian forces just have some hunting on this territory. They poach some bisons, wild horses, and a lot of rare species. Also, they just move species from Ukrainian territory to the Russia, to the zoos, or I don't know, to some their own protected area. So it's quite a bad situation to the nature reserve on occupied territories and on front lines. We have like 15 up to 20 quite big natural reserves on this territory which are damaged, and we don't have a lot of information of some of them. As for exclusion zone, it's quite a good example what can be after the occupation, because we have a lot of landmines, we have a quite big restrictions of management of the territory, because we're close to the Belarusian border, and our defense forces have some fortifications and mining and so on. And it leads to increase in the number of big wildfires. Like we have big wildfires in the exclusion zone in 2015. It was around 16,000 hectares. And the biggest one was in 2020. It was almost 70,000 hectares because of the quite dry winter. There is no precipitation and some climate conditions which lead to very big wildfires. But after the occupation, we also include landmines as impactful factor to this territory. In 2022, we have around 40 or 32,000 hectares of wildfires. It's around half of it was during the occupation, and another half was after the liberation of the territory. And the biggest one we have in the spring, like in May, and just when the firefighters starting to suppress the fire, the fire truck was blown on the landmine. So it's quite dangerous to firefighting in such an environment. So it's usually lead to further destruction of the environment in the territories that were under the occupation.
Hi, this is Xiang Liu from the University College of London, and I've just come back from the front line of Ukraine as a war volunteer and a researcher. And one of the things that really impressed me is that the agriculture really plays a really important role in Ukraine because the fields are just everywhere. And so my question is, have you guys think about the measures to dealing with the soils that may be contaminated by the mines and artilleries to make it can be cultivated again? Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is about remediating some of the soil damage?
Yep.
All right, yeah. So it's a fantastic question. Some of depending on the pollutant, some of it can be remediated with some traditional remediation techniques. Some fields are just going to have to be, you can do phytoremediation, so you can grow crops, especially willow and aspen, and you can pull some of the heavy metals out of the soil. And then those can be disposed of. You can put them in a landfill. You can burn them. You can do lots of other things with them. I think that that could be one tool for dealing with it. I do have a lot of concerns about the various sources of pollutants. Because the Russians are not using. I mean, we know what's in NATO munitions, which are pretty interesting from a chemical perspective. And the Russians are using stuff from North Korea, Iran, China. So I can't imagine what's in those. So there's going to be a lot of questions that need to be answered about that. Unfortunately, Ukraine doesn't have the soil testing labs to test all the soil that's necessary. So this, just due to the nature of the conflict, the nature of, labs are sensitive areas that are easy to destroy. They need power. They need specialized equipment. There's just a lack of testing on all of that stuff. So Ukraine really needs help getting new soil labs set up with cutting edge equipment, and just a huge amount of soil testing needs to be done. Just for example, in the United States, most farm fields get tested a couple of times, at least at the beginning and in the middle of the rotation of the middle of a season. I said rotation because I'm thinking the forester mindset. I got to go the ag mindset. So in the middle of the, farm fields will get tested every couple times throughout the season in the U.S. Ukraine is mostly, as you were pointing out, like farm fields and largely steppe, and there's just not the capacity. So we don't know. Also, in the U.S., we've had soil testing done for the last 100+ years, so we have a long-term data set about what all of, basically every square foot of ag land looks like in the U.S. from a, nutrition and pollution standpoint. That data does not exist for Ukraine. And because of the long history of heavy agricultural as well as industrial use and, destruction of that industry in the war, we don't really know what's been impacted. What was when the Kakhovka Dam was destroyed? There was a lot of, we talked about the 18 kilometers of water. There was also a large amount of tailings in that mine, in that large amount of tailing and sediment that was also spread on the landscape. That's going to be a bunch of, from a chemical standpoint, very interesting things that have come out from the destruction of that dam and then just been spread across the landscape. Sediment behind mines tends to be pretty not great to human health because it has a lot of heavy metals in there, mercury, all kinds of stuff, and so that's just spread across the landscape. A lot of that can't be remediated. The PFAS and FOFs that have been released as part of the war are not really that remediatable, so there's a lot of stuff out there that we just don't know. Some of it can be, a lot of it can't be. Do you have other thoughts?
I do.
Yeah.
So some colleagues of ours who presented their work. This was at the 2023 American Geophysical Union. Welcome back from the front line, by the way. Mapped using very high resolution satellite imagery, 2.5 million artillery craters. So, we'll let our demining colleagues at the next panel elaborate, but about 10% of the artillery probably is unexploded. So it exists within those soils, waiting for someone to accidentally till it, or for some of our friends here to find it and make it safe for eventual remediation activities. But I just wanted to highlight the kind of shocking breadth. Like thousands of these artillery shells are launched every day, and they're just, going in these fields. So characterizing where they are is the first step to being able to have an idea of even where to begin looking. To first clean up unexploded ordnance and then start thinking about remediation.
Got it. Thanks so much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for bringing it up. It's very crucial for us to keep all this question going up. So the question is probably going to be addressed to Oleksandr. It's related to nuclear energy, and we heard about the Chornobyl power plant, but there is a Zaporizhia power plant that is the biggest one in Europe, and it's under the control of Russian occupiers, basically. And I spent the year in Ukraine when the war started, and everyone was concerned about what's going to happen there, and people started buying the iodine in the pharmacies because everybody was ready that something's going to happen there. So do we have any updates, and do we understand what's going to happen if it's going to be back under Ukrainian control or if it's going to stay under Russian control for a while, considering that this is the biggest power plant in Ukraine, in Europe, considering that it was also influenced by the Kakhovka Dam destruction because all this water was used for cooling the reactors, and also considering that we do not have an access to proper data, we cannot control it properly because we obviously get in the fake data from Russian side. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I'm not the quite specialist in the nuclear power plants, but the threats still the same as were during your stay in Ukraine, because we don't know what Russian forces will trying to do with the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant when they are there, because there is a lot of military vehicles, a lot of personnel that's trying to bombard shellings of Ukraine territory from the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. Ukrainian forces wouldn't shoot and bomb anything on the territory near the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, because we know that it's our territory, and if there will be any accident, we will have the same or even quite worse situations than in Chernobyl. So we hope that everything will be fine, and we will have this power plant back to under Ukraine control. But it's quite too hard to say what will be in the future, because as you all know, Russian don't want to remove their forces from power plant. They don't want leave the Ukraine territory that's under the occupation, and it's also quite difficult to understand what will be the positions of the United States that are try to resolve this conflict, because from the information that we see in the media, that the American side want to control this power plant as a natural party of conflict. So it's quite hard to say what will we here in the future in this Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant.
Just one quick question. It's for Taylor. Talked a lot about the bad times for the Black Sea. I'm wondering, in your opinion, in the time that you've studied, what has been the best time for the Black Sea diplomatically, the most hopeful time, and ecologically?
Unfortunately, those periods haven't really overlapped. But I suppose the most hopeful time was the one that many of us were born in and have lived through, which was the fall of communism and the creation of independent states. And suddenly, in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, there was a lot of international interest in the Black Sea and its fate. There were really catastrophic predictions. So in this sense, it was a bad time for the Black Sea. There were catastrophic predictions, maybe even that the gases sequestered in the belly of the sea might escape and poison everyone if the pollution got bad enough. A lot of this was overblown, but it attracted a great amount of attention from the United Nations, from NATO. There were all kinds of partnerships working with the independent countries to have workshops and to discuss these problems. Unfortunately, the money started to disappear and the geopolitical situation got a lot less favorable, especially following the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008. And since then, we're now seeing a return to history in that sense, where the Black Sea's past the best Black Sea's present and future is starting to look a lot more like its past, which is one of rivalry and division and competing blocks. But there's hope, I think, when we're thinking about Ukraine's rebuilding, when we're thinking about new formations, new alliances, to comment, even if it's not the entire sea, to at least think very seriously about the Danube Delta as one of Europe's most biodiverse places, and how to protect it, how to think really seriously about the Bosphorus. Turkey can be a partner in this sense. And so it's not all hopeless, but it's hard to imagine a pan-Black Sea cooperation like we saw for that brief window.
I have a question for Oleksandr. So you're managing forests in a pretty difficult time, in a pretty difficult place. You know, what keeps you going and keeps you positive in those areas?
Not sure. He said it so quickly. I'm not sure he realized it was.
Oh, sorry, Oleksandr. I have a question for you. So.
Oh, yes. Okay.
All right. Right over here. Oh, sorry. Oleksandr, I have a question for you as a forest manager to a forest manager. So you're managing forests in a difficult time, in a difficult place. How do you keep going through day to day and keep your head up? What keeps you going?
It's quite a hard question, because it will be different for different people, for different managers. As I work in the Biosphere Reserve, I most looking on the forest from the perspective of the nature conservation, and we will try to preserve most of the forest of the exclusion zone as much as possible. Also, we have some loggings, it's quite specific territory. In the Ukraine, we have the radiation contamination, and we can't do a lot of management. And also, we don't have a quite good financing support for forest management. As you know, we have quite a lot of problems with the deadwood in the forest. We have problems with a lot of Scotch pines, and it's hard to manage in this condition, because wildfires is quite good. Quite big wildfires are spread in the Scotch pine forest, and probably if the situation doesn't change, we will have quite a lot of wildfires and much more less of the Scotch pines, and we'll have the need to find what we need to done with the forest regeneration. Should we just watch how the nature take its territory and the natural forest will regenerate? Mostly it will be silver birch maybe and some aspen, I don't know. Or we will need to make some plantation. It's quite difficult for the exclusion zone because we have different opinions of the with the management of the exclusion zone agency. But for the foresters that work in the other part of the territory, there are a lot of different things that they need include on the forest management. As I know some forest enterprises that were under the occupation, they work on the demining of the territory and just to restore the general forest management as it was before the war. I don't know what will be in the region that are on the front line because demining of the territory is quite difficult, and I think it's will not be realistic in at least next 10 up to 20 years. And what will be with that forest, it's quite hard to say, and what will be managers do on these territories. There is need to make some national strategy for Ukraine, what we will do with the forest and other territories that are damaged by war. I don't know if I have answer on your question.
I have a question for any of you who have information on this. Are there any studies being done on the insect life, especially pollinators, but also insect life in general?
It's an excellent question, but I have not seen anything. I think that, there's with understory plants, so your forbs, so your non-grass, non-sedge flowering plants, these ones, there's a lot of resilience. So, and as you destroy a forest, there is potential for rebirth. So I think that things are probably not that they're not hopeless, but there's going to be some loss of imperiled insects. I know with some of the invertebrates that were impacted by the there were a number of invertebrates in the aquatic invertebrates in the Dnieper that were impacted, as well as in the Black Sea. The freshwater adapted species are great in the freshwater, but when they get introduced to the Black Sea, they're dead. And then the saltwater inhabitants of the Black Sea get killed by the introduction of freshwater. So I don't think anyone has looked specifically at invertebrate life and entomology. I would expect that beetles are probably doing very well right now with all the dead wood on the ground. So that's, that's some positives there.
I seem to recall a dead zone in the Black Sea at a certain depth. Is that expanding, contracting? Has the war at all made an impact on it? And can it ever become alive? Can you, address that?
Yeah, sure. So this is one of the interesting things about the Black Sea is exactly this, and that's its chemistry. And so we don't know exactly when the Black Sea was created, but 10,000-ish years ago, it was a freshwater lake. And then somehow it came in contact with the Mediterranean and was Mediterraneanized, right? And became partially a brackish or more saline. Whether or not this happened over the course of thousands of years with a little bit spilling here and there is a question, or whether it happened in one giant flood. This was a theory in the early 1990s that actually maybe this was Noah's flood from the Bible that we hear about, was the connection of the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. But as a result of its unique geography, about 90% of the Black Sea is anoxic, which means it doesn't have oxygen in it. And it's been due to the processes in the sea, it's anoxic, and it's also filled with hydrogen sulfide, which is a toxic gas. This sounds really terrible and really frightening, but it's the state of the sea, and it has been for a long time. Much of the Baltic Sea is anoxic, but the Black Sea is the largest pool of anoxic water on the planet. And so the first 150 meters or so is living, and underneath that, not much can survive. As I said, there were fears historically that through pollution, or I read KGB files actually in Kyiv in the Secret Services or the Security Services Archive from 1984, where the KGB was saying, what if the NATO used an atom bomb in the sea to release all of this gas over us? This has not, of course, happened, but there are fears that with climate change, as the temperature of the sea changes, that anoxic layer could rise, and the living layer, so-called, might shrink. But this is mostly speculative. Good question.
Yeah, I think we'll take one more question.
I'm not sure if this is for this panelists or the next one, you tell me, but I wanted to ask about atmosphere and what is happening to atmosphere when we have all the wildfires occurring and so on. Yes.
It's real bad. Yeah. Oleksandr can speak to that some more about the damage from the fires in Chernobyl, but we did have a presentation with a professor at the Life Science University of Ukraine, the Radiation Agriculture Department, who mentioned that one of the fires, breathing the smoke from that fire was like smoking 600 cigarettes an hour. So that's not great. But then if we step back and we look at the CO2 emissions and the other, greenhouse gas emissions from this war, it's pretty immense. I mean, just anytime you fire up a jet, there's huge emissions. Anytime you do any of this, is huge emissions. So, I mean, that's the other thing about this war that I think it's important to communicate. Obviously it is a war in Ukraine, and it's a war in people who, live in Ukraine, as well as people who are dependent on food from Ukraine. It's also a war in the Black Sea, as we've discussed, but we are all impacted, and we all live under one climate. And so all of the destruction and the fire and the burning, and as well as the emissions in producing munitions and all that kind of stuff, that impacts all of us, whether we like it or not. We are all impacted, and I don't think anyone has quite calculated CO2 emissions from the war, but I would imagine that they're very high. Corey, thoughts?
I haven't, but the building damage data. So we have a lot of sources of military emissions in war and conflict related to direct fighting, forest fires, but also damage to the built infrastructure and carbon costs of reconstruction. So there's two things I like to highlight when it comes to dust. In New York, we are still dealing with the implications of toxic dust inhalation from the 9/11 attacks. Friends, parents are still suffering those consequences. And I think exposure to toxic dust from destruction in wartime is overlooked. And it's something we will see the effects of in a public and environmental health standpoint for decades to come. That's an atmospheric effect, right? Carbon is an atmospheric effect, but yeah.
So I'll just report this secondhand, but I've read from reports from the Ukrainian Environmental Ministry. They estimate that the emissions released by the conflict and mobilization and everything else will total something like the total emissions of the Netherlands for a year. So that's one referent for you.
And that's on top of, or that's without the loss of sequestration from Ukrainian forests and ecosystems as well. So there's also loss there.
All right. I think we're at time. I'd like to give a round of applause to our panelists. Really appreciate all of the information that you've given us to the damage to nature. I think we're going into a break, and then the next panel we hope will be a little more hopeful than this one.
Thank you, Oksana, so much. Couple logistics points. Thank you. I have to say also, I mean, it's sad and it's pretty depressing, but the hope is that there are amazing experts working on this. Thank you, Oleksandr, for staying up late with us. Thank you.
Nice to take part in this event. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. So we're going to have session 2, as you know, is about an hour or so, and afterwards there's going to be more time for engagement. We hope you stay, have a glass of wine with us, and continue the dialogue. And that's it. I think I will hand the floor over to Jasper, and I'm going to bring in the rest of our guests.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jasper Bauer. I am a PhD candidate at Columbia University and president of Demining Research Community. It's a organization me and Gabriel founded for improving technology to detect landmines around the world. And I'm also the co-founder of SafePro AI, which develops a software to detect landmines, where we are actively working inside of Ukraine, mostly in Mykolaiv region, as well as Kherson and others. So that's my background. And today we are on the second session on nature and danger in Ukraine. We have an awesome panel today, experts in both mine detection, mine action. We have the Chris Watley, who is the executive director of Halo Trust, the largest humanitarian nonprofit for demining, joining us today virtually, as well as Serhi, a professor. And I'll let everyone introduce themselves just to give you a scope of who we're talking with. Gabriel, similar to my background, is in mine action technology and demining, and Brian is a master forester. So we have a really rounded board today, and I will start by letting Brian begin with his background and presentation. This format's going to be slightly different than the first one. We're going to have PowerPoint presentations, which you'll be able to see here, followed by questions by the audience, and then at the end we'll have more general questions.
Thank you, Jasper. I have a presentation. I have a presentation. If it's possible to open that one.
Yep. If you want to run it, you can come up.
Okay, sure. I'll come right up. It's the Brian UA, the one next to it. That one. Yep. Okay. There it is. Thank you. Let me get my 5-minute timer started. Okay. My name is Brian Milikovsky. I had the opportunity to live and work in Ukraine in several stages as a forester, forest conservationist, and an expert in economic recovery programming in eastern Ukraine over the last 15 years, including very meaningful for myself stretch, 6 years in the city of Severodonetsk. 6 years in the city of Severodonetsk, working for USAID-funded programs from 2015 to to the beginning of the large-scale invasion, full-scale invasion. And today I'm going to speak to that part of Ukraine, the east, specifically the amazing forests and grasslands along the Siversky Donets River, the largest river east of the Dnipro. Calvin mentioned to us that the Luhansk region, the easternmost of the 3 oblasts that supports the Siversky Donets landscape, lost, perhaps 80 to 90% of its forests. Here's one of them. This is the Kremena forest. Anyone who's from or been to eastern Ukraine knows what an unbelievable oasis this was. What a extraordinary natural and cultural landscape, obliterated by Russia's aggression. And it's a little bit tempting to look at this and think, okay, this was pristine, and then we lost it because of aggression, when in fact the aggression triggered a landscape that had many legacies that we really need to get our heads around in order to understand what comes next. Because this was not just a pristine landscape. So really, really quickly, these are some historic maps. Eastern Ukraine gets settled very late, comparatively. It's a lot like the American frontier. It's like the mid 18th century. into the early 19th century is when European settlers, Ukrainians, other people brought in when the Russian Empire finally defeats the Ottoman Empire in this area, and the wild field is opened up. So we get a quite late period when Europeans arrive and start saying, "Hey, what is growing here?" And what they found out, this shows modern day Luhansk Oblast, a piece of it. That big crook in the river is around Lysychansk and Kremena. What they find is a mosaic, a natural mosaic of forests, grasslands, and wetlands along the river. That really doesn't look a lot like the forest that many of us experienced before the war. And let's just keep that in mind. There were park-like open pine forests. There were sandy steppes. There were thousands of little lakes and wetlands scattered about. It was a mosaic. It was very diverse. These are some of the components of that mosaic that they found. These widely spaced pine forests that, if anyone here has been to the western U.S., they're quite a bit like a ponderosa pine parkland in like Oregon, for instance. Mixed, all of a sudden, just tumbling into these beautiful forests of oak and linden. And then in a dry area, you get up into that sandy steppe, which supports just fantastic biodiversity, very different from what you find in the forest. Or that was one of the remnant old oak woodlands up in the left-hand corner. This is what was there. It didn't take more than about 100 years of settling to turn most of those areas along the Siversky Donetsk River into shifting sand dunes. This is overgrazing, over-farming. Serfs get liberated and are given the worst land, and they have to feed themselves, and they plow it up, and it becomes a shifting sand dune, basically. So there was a natural mosaic, a very rich ecosystem. It becomes this, and this becomes a point of memory that everyone looks to. There was a wasteland, and we turned it into a forest. Well, no, there was a natural ecosystem that really suffered from humans, and we reforested it. But I can just see I'm going to go a little over 5 minutes. Please be patient, okay? I'm really going to try. Because, yeah, well, there we go. Because at this moment, this is the beginning of the 20th century, the end of the Tsarist period, the beginning of Soviet rule in Ukraine, and you have this wasteland, basically, which is, again, the moment that a lot of memory begins in the region about these natural ecosystems. What are we going to do with it? The response is stick as many trees into the ground as we possibly can, almost entirely Scots pines. They'll stop the sand. There won't be sandstorms in our growing towns anymore. This is progress. And this guy up in the top is Dr. Vysotsky, one of the great foresters of this part of the world historically. Born in Chernihiv, died in Kharkiv. A great Ukrainian scientist, although he lived in two empires that wouldn't necessarily let him be recognized that way. And he said, please don't do this. This is a dry landscape. It needs some trees. It needs grasslands. It needs some open sand to capture the rainfall underground and hold it for human uses, for agriculture, to have healthy ecosystems, because if we stick too many trees in the ground, they will respirate that water away, and we'll have drought, and we'll run out of water for agriculture and for cities, and the trees that we do have will get dried out and they'll burn. Please don't do this. No one listens to him, especially not in the Soviet Union. They fill the landscape with trees. It was an extraordinary effort. It's still also a moment of enormous memory in eastern Ukraine. Our ancestors took back the wasteland. They planted these incredible forests, and they were wonderful forests. I say were because in eastern Ukraine, they're essentially gone. But what we get is just a landscape packed with trees. Again, anyone here from western US or who's been there knows you can have too many trees in a forested landscape if you also have fire. And let's say in the 1990s, we get to this landscape, a century of afforestation and reforestation. It's beautiful, it's wonderful. My in-laws, my wife, my friends, everyone knows this as the backdrop to living in the Donbass. And it's also a very climatically fragile place. I'm not going to get it down into the weeds of these statistics, but basically temperature is constantly going up over the last century. Precipitation is concentrating in shorter and shorter periods, more and more drought days, explosively flammable forests. planted too tightly. They're wonderful. They do so many things for society. We love them. They're also extremely flammable. That's 2020. Between the two wars, war certainly exacerbated these giant fires in Luhansk Oblast in 2020, but primarily this is because of climate change. And it leads us to, the landscape just comes undone. This is both war and just all the other things that contribute to make this such a flammable landscape. I was there for much of the time to see this process starting. Since 2022, it has accelerated to the point where we largely have lost the pine forests of eastern Ukraine. Very few words about what next. So when this all happened, these ecosystems respond very differently. On the left, that's a planted pine plantation. Sorry, repetitive. An artificial pine plantation planted by people. Enormous work. Fire goes through in 2020, obliterates every single tree. There's nothing. On the right is a natural oak woodland that was part of that natural mosaic. It's left over from what we saw. It suffers, but survives. It's more resilient to this. In eastern Ukraine, it's often said that you just can't grow pine naturally. It's too dry. We have to plant it. This is the forester's culture in eastern Ukraine and many other places in Ukraine and other countries that were heavily influenced by Soviet science. In 2014, the first war, 10,000 hectares burned near Stanitsa Luhanska. It's dangerous. This is full of unexploded ordnance. Nothing to be done. Everyone said it's going to turn into shifting sands. It's going to be an ecological disaster. It regenerates. Patchily, slowly, unevenly, but this is absolutely a functioning pine forest ecosystem, regenerated by nature, and as a result of the fires and loss of forest because of the war. So we're just not going to be able to bring back exactly what we had before the war. We have thousands and thousands of contaminated acres. We have foresters in the army, abroad. We have lost many of them. We won't have the labor force to just be replanting, planting. We're entering a giant experiment with the regeneration of eastern Ukraine. And some of the things that we're going to see probably are a return of that mosaic. And we may need to embrace that on some level. There's a place here for grasslands in very dry places. Natural regeneration on the right, that's the Kremenna forest before it burned. Some areas that were allowed to naturally regenerate. It can happen. Wetlands are returning because that natural hydrology that Dr. Vysotsky warned us about a century ago is actually returning because we don't have so many planted pine trees, pumping all the water out into the atmosphere. It's going to be difficult, a little bit traumatic for people to watch, but nature's kind of at the steering wheel again in eastern Ukraine. And we need to adapt to that because that is the future of the regeneration of these ecosystems. Seversky Donets landscape, thank you. Sorry I went over.
Thank you, Brian. One quick question for you. If we let natural regeneration do a lot more of the work and are less reliant on planting trees, such as done in the past, does that provide the same value to society, economically, compared to these Scott forests?
Well, it's going to be a challenge. I mean, those forests were an amazing resource. They were an employment source. There were small sawmills in eastern Ukraine. They reinforced all of those famous coal mines. They're reinforced with Scots pine timbers, much of which was grown locally. People are really going to miss a lot of those values, and we are probably heading into a period when we can't be trying to generate the same financial values that ecosystem could before. I would argue it was coming undone already because of climate change. Now we really need to focus on hydrology. We have the mines contaminating groundwater. We have everything that's been added by the war. That natural mosaic can do an enormous amount of remediation. But that's going to be an enormous mental change for people who really want that green wall of pine trees back. And many of the foresters, for instance, who want to get back to the system they were used to. We have a really big, difficult dialogue in eastern Ukraine after liberation.
Thank you. We'll have questions at the end, so save your questions for Brian here. Next, we'll go to Dr. Shevchenko.
Thank you, Jasper.
Yep, the screen's yours.
Let me share the screen. My name is Sher Shevchenko. I hold Ph.D. in economics, and I am an associate professor in Lviv Polytechnic National University. I have nearly 20 years of teaching experience, and my academic background is closely related to National Forestry University of Ukraine, where I got my bachelor degree, and which explains my deep interest in environmental, economic, and sustainable development. I'm very grateful to have an opportunity to speak today. Unfortunately, I can't see whole audience, but I saw some familiar faces on camera, which is very pleasant, and I'm very glad to be here. It's an honor to take part in this vital conversation and on environmental recovery. As a founder of Eco-Fortress Restore Together initiative, I'm here to share some reflections and findings on the environmental consequences of war and our work to restore balance, particularly in Lviv region. The war in Ukraine has deeply scarred not only the cities and infrastructure, but also natural ecosystems. We are witnessing the degradation of soils, contamination of water, and destruction of landscapes. The damage is not abstract, it's visible in every region, and Lviv is not exception. That's why we launched Eco-Fortress Restoring Together, a project that combines scientific research, community engagement, and youth education to rebuild ecological systems step by step. Lviv has historically been known as a city of parks, but this identity is under threat. With the influx of more than 200,000 internally displaced persons, the city population has multiplied. That growth, combined with increased transportation and construction activity, has strained our green infrastructure. Recreational zones are overloaded, biodiversity is under pressure, and the city's famous green spaces are shrinking or becoming degraded. We studied the condition of green areas and discovered that only 17% of vascular plants species in Lviv are native. At the same time, 47 rare species protected by the Red Book still survive here. That is a sign of resilience, but also of weakness. One more issue that surprised us was the effect of light intensity on vegetation. Our research shows that dense construction leads to shaded green zones, reducing sunlight exposure. This impacts photosynthesis and weakens grass and shrub cover. Some parks experience soil desiccation and even loss of biodiversity due to excessive and insufficient sunlight. Moreover, the urban heat island effect caused by concrete and asphalt trapping heat further damages and microclimate. Grasslands suffer, air quality declines, and natural cooling functions are lost. Strategic planning of green spaces must now include insulation management and species selection tailored to new climatic realities. Another painful issue was the uncontrolled cutting of trees in the city, especially during the energy crisis of winter 2022-2023. While some trees were removed for safety or urban planning, thousands were cut with no clear inventory or oversights. In 2023 alone, over 3,500 trees were cut in Lviv, but only 240 were planted. Without a digital mapping, on a proper record of green spaces, it's impossible to track losses or enforce responsible greening policies. This is an urgent call for municipal and civil collaboration. Let me close in saying something else. Just 2 days ago, we celebrate Easter, a holiday of hope and renewal. This is especially symbolic in the context of Ukraine's restoration. Ukraine's recovery is not just about rebuilding homes, rebuilding roads. It's also about restoring nature, healing the land, and building ecological resilience. The war has taught us to the cost of neglecting our environment. Now we have a chance to rebuild smarter, greener, and more united. With the collaboration of science, civil society, youth, and government, we can transform this crisis into an opportunity to make Lviv and all of Ukraine a global example of sustainable recovery. Thank you. I will be glad to answer on the question.
Thank you, Dr. Shevchenko. Does anyone in the audience like to ask a question? If not, I have actually a few questions for you. So what are the main challenges in focusing on Western Ukraine versus Eastern Ukraine? Can you speak a little bit about, are there any similarities and differences that in terms of environmental protection and restoration?
Thank you for your question. This question could be broken in a few parts. I mean that the full-scale Russian invasion in Ukraine has led to extensive environmental degradation. Particularly, it was affecting wide areas and led due to explosions, artillery shelling, and the construction of fortification. For example, as of late of 2024, approximately 139,000 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory was potentially contaminated with landmines and explosive remnants of war, posing significant risk of human safety and affecting land use for example, for agriculture or for habitation. Another challenge is the presence of, like I said, unexploded ordnance and other remnants of war, which pose serious risks for human safety. The destruction of infrastructure in different regions are different, and it's critical concern with explosion disrupting soil structure and introduction pollutants such as heavy metals and fuel deposits. We had some big damages caused by military action, which shows us how wide the pollutant can be spread. For example, after the destruction of Kakhovka Dam, it was in June 2023, a huge amount of heavy metals was released in the Dnieper River, and it leads to long-term ecological impact comparable, for example, with the Chernobyl disaster. Furthermore, lack of funding and long-term strategies hampers large-scale land reclamation. Post-conflict zones often suffer from institutional instability, and ecological recovery tends to be deprioritized compared to immediate humanitarian or infrastructural needs. As a result, spontaneous recovery often occurs through private farmers, individuals' initiative, frequently involving risky and lacking a constructive approach. In conclusion, I mean, there is no one scenario in different parts, and every occasion should be considered in a different way, and there is a difficulty between as a country is big, and there is a big difference between the landscape in different regions. I believe I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting the nuances. It's an incredibly complex problem. So thank you, Dr. Shevchenko. Next, we'll have Gabriel.
My name is Gabriel Steinberg. My background is in computer science, specifically in computer vision and artificial intelligence, for the application of humanitarian demining and specifically finding landmines. I've been working on this since about 2019. It started as an undergraduate research project and has since graduated to a commercial company, which is pretty cool. I'm the lead software engineer of SafePro AI, this commercial company, and I'll be talking about our, hold on, let me get my, okay, 5 minutes starts. I'll be talking about detecting and mapping landmines with drones and AI. So I would like to start with a little exercise. I like to start with this exercise because instead of the stats, there's a lot of stats about demining, it really gives you the feeling of the contamination and what deminers and image analysts are really dealing with. So the PFM-1 is a small anti-personnel landmine. Prior to the full-scale invasion, it was frequently found in Afghanistan after the Soviet-Afghan War, but now it is found in very large quantities in Ukraine. This is one drone image that was taken in our, or that was processed using our software. This image is from the Mykolaiv region, and this image contains a PFM-1 landmine. It might be difficult and, in fact, impossible to see it at this resolution, so I will zoom in a little bit. You can see the scale bar at the bottom. It's still kind of impossible. Yeah, I'll make it a little easier. It's, I actually see it in this image, but it's really hard. So, yeah, there it is. It's really there. I didn't just plant it. This is a mine about the size of your hand. If you step on it, you will be maimed. You will not be killed, most likely, but it is a very, very nasty device, and it is deployed in air-fired mortars or rockets. So it is on the surface for civilians to come in contact with. As you can see, it's very difficult to find this thing. This is just one image in 2 hectares, or about 5 acres. One image out of 1,200 images, very, very difficult. And this is the manual labor that used to take place and still does, but hopefully we're trying to make this a more automated process, or a more efficient process, let's say. So that was 2 hectares. There's millions of hectares of contaminated land in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian-controlled region and in the Russian-controlled region. There is a lot of landmines. We believe that UAVs and AI are the best solution to this problem, although it's not a solution. It's just a one step along the path to reclaiming this land. Just from a recent report from these 4 organizations, the Rapid Damage and Needs Assessment, I believe it is, or Rapid Needs and Damage Assessment. Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction priorities for 2025, one of the 3 was demining. this is an incredibly wide-reaching and urgent problem. It really is the number one hindrance to many other of these remediation endeavors that we've been talking about here. It is the first step. If you cannot access the land by foot, you're really not going to be able to do much else. Forestry, port infrastructure, the Black Sea has mines, as we've talked about, agriculture, and just living your normal life, returning to your home. Demining is necessary for all of these. Just a little bit about us. We provide landmine detection software for deminers. Our goal is to make sense of the vast amounts of drone imagery that are being collected in Ukraine. Demining organizations have the capacity to fly drones. They have a lot of drones from the military. You know, the Ukrainian shift to unmanned aerial vehicles has permeated the humanitarian sector as well, and it is being used very efficiently and effectively in demining. Our goal is to have the lowest barrier of entry possible so that these drones can be used. The skill is not too high. There is very little upfront cost and training necessary, and you can affect the most change possible in the least amount of time. Just a little bit about our impact. It's hard to quantify real impact in terms of lives saved, land reclaimed, but we find that these are a relatively good proxy. We're nearing 25,000 landmines detected through our customers in Ukraine. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'll hand it to you guys.
Does anyone in the audience have a question for Gabriel?
To or Jason's, do you actually give me 1 second to reformulate? I'll get back to you.
Hey Gabriel, a really cool project. I think this is the future of the Ukrainian reconstruction and making safer zone. I have a question. I found one of the similar projects that was identifying the anomalies on the surface to detect the mines that were actually buried under the ground. Is your project also support something like that, or could it be extended with that functionality?
So, I'm sure the modality you're talking about is either with thermal or with magnetometry. These methods are effective in specific circumstances. I mean, thermal is effective at a specific time of day, specific soil types, specific landmines. It's a narrow, detecting things under the ground is very difficult, and each of these subsurface modalities are effective in specific circumstances. What we focus on is wide-scale understanding of the contamination. So optical is really the only thing that you can survey at that scale. We do about, or our customers do a hectare in about 15 minutes. And you can get indicators of subsurface ordnance as well as all the surface ordnance. So there's a lot of research being done in that space, but it's not at that scale. And I mean, it's certainly necessary, but it's perhaps more nascent, like more underdeveloped, or not underdeveloped. Yeah, exactly, underdevelopment. Thank you.
For either currently or in the future, is this AI technology useful in conjunction with the robots or drones used to remotely remove or neutralize mines when they are found? Is that in development or existing?
That's a good question. There's a lot of work being done on in the military side. With the humanitarian sector, these these endeavors usually have quite some space between them. The non-technical survey is the first look of the extent of contamination. Then the technical survey, you step onto the contaminated area and get, do more invasive methods of detecting exactly where the contamination is and the confirmed regions. And then clearance and destruction is quite, they're all separated by like several weeks sometimes. So the speed, it's not really the bottleneck in terms of, like, in my opinion, the destruction of the ordnance is not really the bottleneck in terms of what needs to be done to do this whole system the fastest. The army is doing a lot of stuff on that, the Ukrainian army, and but the humanitarian side, I think mostly they have there's a lot of innovation on the detection, and I think the destruction side, which I'm not as much of an expert in, I think that side is mostly still just manual sandbags, or like if it's destruction in place, or reusing some of the munitions. Yeah, that's.
Hi. So slightly adjacent, hopefully not too much, but Gabriel, I'm thinking from where you sit, you hopefully have an angle on this. But we've been reading, in mostly pro-Ukrainian sources, but that there's reasons to be optimistic about Ukraine's own industry in the last 12 months or so. You might be seeing some of that, literally. Can you make any qualifications on how the drone war is going from Ukraine's side, based on what you're seeing?
So you're talking about like the militarily. Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on that, but the Ukrainian drone production is booming. No pun intended. There's millions of drones being produced in Ukraine every year. And like the amount of money that has, or the amount of munitions that have been developed outside of Ukraine is being imported into Ukraine is shrinking, and the amount of munitions that are being produced in Ukraine, especially through these independent drone workshops all around the country, is increasing. The amount of drone expertise in terms of maintenance, building, piloting, this is really very, very high in Ukraine, and this plays well to our application. There's a lot of really great drone pilots. A lot of people know how to hack and maintain and analyze drone imagery. That started on the military side, and it is benefiting the humanitarian side.
Thank you, and hopefully we'll have time for more questions at the end. In terms of talking about experts in demining, we're going to go to our next speaker here, Chris, and I'll let Chris share his screen and introduce himself. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Let me see if I can share here. Can you let me know if you're seeing my screen? Well, I'm sorry you're having to wait for me to manage Zoom here. We are a Teams-based organization, so my apologies on the tech side. Tell you what, I'm just going to talk you through this because fundamentally you've seen some good imagery from our previous presenters. Let me just stop sharing. First of all, thank you so much for this opportunity, and it was great to be able to hear Brian, Serhi, and Gabriel. As was mentioned, I am the executive director of the U.S. side of the HALO Trust, which is a global landmine clearance organization. We have about 10,000 employees. We work in 30 different countries. So about half of those are countries with legacy conflicts like Angola or Cambodia, where the war ended 40, 50 years ago. But the explosive threat remains viable and deadly until it's cleared. In particular, plastic-based landmines will stay viable for hundreds of years potentially. And then about the other half of our work is in countries in conflict itself. So Ukraine is by far our largest program. We have 1,600 Ukrainian staff. They are locally hired, locally trained. We've been there since 2015. So we were working before this phase of the war. We were working in the Donbass in those kind of beautiful landscapes that Brian was sharing. Our two headquarters were Mariupol and Kramatorsk. After the full-scale Russian invasion, at the moment of the invasion, we had 400 staff. About 200 of them were able to recover to Kyiv. The others were either, joined up the military and went off to serve their country, or were stuck behind Russian lines. But from that 200, we rebuilt and now have, eightfold the capacity we had before. We work in the places you would expect, in that if you think back to one of Gabriel's slides where he showed contamination spots, so these are evidence points of airstrikes, minefields, other evidence points of explosives. It really traces the arc of the conflict. You have a few evidence points up around Chernihiv and Kyiv from the first month of the conflict, where the Russians were pushed back at the gates of Kyiv. You have a lot more dense contamination in Kharkiv, Mykolaiv, and Kherson, where the September offensive in 2022 was successful in pushing back the Russians, but where they had 6 months to lay industrial scale minefields. And then you have a whole bunch of evidence points that are right on the current lines of contact. And those are places where we actually don't really have access. As a humanitarian organization, we have to work within 30 kilometers back of the front line. So in my most recent visit in December and out with our teams in Mykolaiv, I could hear the artillery in the background, but we are there, working in areas that are sanctioned for humanitarian work, where civilians are looking to return, and overwhelmingly what we're clearing are agricultural lands. If I had better technology skills, I'd be showing you images of surface laid mines, because Gabriel raised a good point. His company is one of the tech partners we work with. Great praise to them and to others who are innovating in this space. And in Ukraine, the majority of landmines that we come across, and we clear tens of thousands, are surface laden. So of the 30,000 landmines or so that we have cleared since the beginning of this phase of the conflict over the last 3 years, over half of those would be big Russian anti-tank mines that were laid in haste, for the most part, surface laid. So they do create a pattern that technologies like that, pioneered by SafePro, are very effective in identifying. The actual scale of contamination across Ukraine, and Scher mentioned this, he was giving you statistics of the number of square kilometers estimated to be contaminated or touched by conflict and potentially at risk of landmines or other unexploded ordnance. I like to think of it in comparative terms. So it's about the current threat, as estimated by the Ukrainian government, is about the size of the state of New York, not the city, but the state. So and I'm a 20th century person, so I think in terms of square miles instead of kilometers, that's about 53,000 square kilometers. Now, it's gotten better, I'd say, over the last 18 months, because 18 months ago, I would have been saying that's the state of Florida, which is, 20% larger than New York State. Still a big number, but what has caused that to shrink are good efforts to survey and confirm where the explosives aren't. So one of the things that we do is we fly those drones that were just discussed. We send out teams of our 1,600 staff that really breaks down into about 150 deployed teams at any time. And about a third of those are teams that are flying a drone and doing survey work, most importantly, to figure out where the mines aren't, to enable farmers to get back onto their fields the fastest, and then identify potentially contaminated areas. You cordon those off, you keep people out of them, and you clear them through a system of priorities. And then the rest of our teams would be doing that hard kind of slow-going clearance work. So that's the size of it. It has gotten better. It's gone from Florida to New York. So this is something that can be fixed. But our first priority, and the priority of companies like Gabriel's, is to shrink the map. So the best investment of time and resources in demining is to do good survey using imagery, satellite imagery, drone imagery, AI tools behind it, but then an awful lot of human support on top of it, a lot of actually getting out to farms and talking to people and looking back over time of flashpoints from the conflict from the early phase of the conflict using things like satellite imagery that we were able to get through pro bono partnerships. There's a lot of support that needs to go in addition to that AI, but that's a key component of it. So we got to shrink the map, first of all. I would say, just based on best practices and what we've done in other country contexts over the 30 years of our existence, that it's more likely that the real threat is 10% of that. So think of the state of New York and take 90% of it and realize that that's okay. It's locked away from economic benefit right now because of the fear of landmines. That's one of the worst things about landmines. They kill people, yes, and they injure people, hundreds, over 1,000 civilian victims since this phase of the war began. But more importantly, they create fear and lock out economic use and other purposes too. So we need to complete that survey work. We need to have protocols in place from the Ukrainian government to, accept kind of the protocols for that survey. There are UN standards for how you conduct that, and the moment you are confident in telling a civilian population it's okay to go back in that area. I'll say the Ukrainian government's been a little bit slow in adopting those standards, but have come further towards them in adopting them over the last, really the last few months of this year. There's a level of risk that has to be accepted in that. Our recommendations are to use the UN International Mine Action Standards that have been born through years of creation. So that's that. So how do you shrink the map? And then the next thing is to shrink the clock. In that, great question about what are some other technologies that can be used to actually clear those landmines that are identified, and also a good question about buried mines versus surface mines. Buried mines involve a very painstaking process to clear. Now, even though the majority of what we've dealt with since this phase of the war have been surface-laid mines, both those PFMs like Gabriel was showing you, and these large, think of the size of a pizza. That's what an anti-tank mine looks like. But we can't depend on that being the sole threat. So we end up spending lots of time clearing anti-personnel and anti-tank mines that are buried. And one of the challenges we face is that if you're a deminer, so if you picture in your mind's eye from whatever war movie or news coverage that you can call upon, you've got a deminer who's swinging a detector in front of them. In World War II, it would have been a simple metal detector. Now we've got some ground penetrating radar on top of the metal detector and some other things, but it's still the same thing. It looks not that much different than you might see someone swinging on a beach looking for a lost watch. The most dangerous moment and most time-consuming moment of that process is the moment they get a signal. So they've identified something in the ground. It's a return of either a mass if they're using ground penetrating radar, or it's metal. And then you back up a meter, you dig down 15 centimeters, and you slowly trench towards it. That's the most dangerous part of our work. If that mine's tilted in some direction that you don't expect, you could strike it and put enough pressure on it to cause a detonation. Our work, is deadly work. And you have to do it in a very, very slow, meticulous way. And it's that kind of process that causes our work, this field of landmine clearance, to be expressed in decades instead of years. And that's something that I hope with technology, and Ukraine's the place for it to be achieved because of the technological prowess of Ukraine and its people, and because the urgency of the challenge, that we do have to introduce new technologies. We have to, automate that excavation process. There's still nothing more sensitive than a human moving forward towards that signal. But there are ways with mini excavators and autonomous operation of mini excavators, at least under certain circumstances. You got to have some pretty flat land. But having spent a lot of time in Mykolaiv and Kherson and other places, there are a lot of flat lands where we clear, where you can speed that process. So take something and achieve efficiency factors of 2x, 3x. Those are kind of what we're seeing on testing out some of those technologies, but also the safety factors with it, and that ultimately the safety of our workforce is paramount. We employ lots of war widows, wounded war vets, people from all walks of life, and their safety is paramount for us. So it's really those two things. It's how do you shrink the map, first of all, and great example of how you do that with Gabriel and his company, and how do you shrink the clock? I think that we are, looking for as many partnerships with tech companies and others to try to address both of those challenges. And the way I'd like to think about it is that if anyone remembers Halo, if anyone in that audience is of my age and can remember 1997 and Princess Diana walking through a minefield, she was walking through that minefield with a Halo truss. And I had the privilege of being there 22 years after her walk when her son Prince Harry joined us in that exact same area. So she was in a devastated landscape that looked a lot like some of the other imagery that the other panelists have just shown. 22 years later, the exact same backdrop is a medical college. And Prince Harry was walking down this street and all the medical students were kind of lined up in their lab coats to greet him. And that's a wonderful success. It's a sign of hope for Ukraine that you can address this. You've already shrunk it from Florida to New York, and you can shrink it further with good tech. But that was 22 years for Angola to do that. The world can't wait that long with Ukraine. Ukraine's different. Even if you view it, because I'm here in Washington, I'm dealing with the U.S. government as my primary duty, and we need to express the importance of work like this in the context of American self-interest. Well, the price of vegetable oil in the United States on grocery stores in the United States went up by 50% in the first 3 weeks after the Russian invasion. There are, direct kind of kitchen table issues that come from the inability of Ukraine to play the role it needs to play in feeding the world that affect Americans in their pocketbooks. But I'm also someone who spends a lot of time in Somalia and the Horn of Africa and other places where Ukraine, before the war was feeding 400 million people worldwide. So in terms of American grocery prices, global food security, that's not acceptable. The timelines of the sector that we've been part of ever since that Princess Diana moment, where you express the clearance dates in decades and not years, isn't acceptable. I think that there's great leadership in the Ukrainian government to rally towards those kind of innovations. I think there's still some bureaucracy to get pieces of equipment certified and get UN mine action standards adopted legally. I get it. You're fighting a war, and that's the first priority. But if we can keep that attention on it and focus on the prize, I think there's a lot that can be achieved. So sorry for the long-winded remarks.
Thank you, Chris. Is there any audience questions directly for Chris? And then after one question, we'll open it up to the whole panel for whatever you've been saving.
Real quick, thank you for your presentation. Can you address the delivery system of this PFM1 anti-personnel mine? Do you have to be personally dispersed as a person, or is there other delivery methods? And also, to clear the mine, do you have to? Can you detonate en masse, or does it be painstakingly mine by mine, specifically these anti-personnel mines?
Well, great questions. That PFM is largely rocket artillery delivered, so it's a scatterable mine out of Soviet era rocket artillery. Sometimes you'll see in news reports you'll see the tail of a rocket sticking out of the ground in a dramatic way. And in fact, in the middle of the city of Kharkiv in March of 2022, there were lots of those rockets sticking there. Those are actually empty rockets that have dispersed their loads of either cluster munitions or scatterable mines like the PFM. So it is largely a surface-laid device that, hence SafePro's focus on it. So there's that. And then in terms of actual how we dispose of the active landmines we find through that signal detection process, it is largely in situ destruction. So you dig to that signal, you find out it's a mine, you put a small bit of plastic explosives next to it, and you destroy it in place. That is the safest way of doing it. Now, for those surface-laid anti-tank mines, where you can see the fuse and things like that, there are ways to diffuse them and dispose them in mass. But if it is a buried landmine, you're not going to want to try to dust off the top and dig out from underneath it. You're going to destroy it in place.
Can I ask a question? Nice to see you, Mr. Wadley. I want to ask you a question like member of an academic community of university. Considering that today's students will definitely carry the weight of rebuilding post-war societies. It's pity, but it's true. Particularly in regions like Ukraine, how does the United Nations Association envision its role in shaping education pathways with civic responsibility and maybe global solidarity?
Excellent question, and it relates to a different chapter of my life. So before I joined the Halo Trust 6 years ago, I was executive director of the United Nations Association of the United States. I still am someone who is focused very much on mobilizing the American society to address global humanitarian challenges. I will say that we're fortunate in that in the United States, landmine clearance remains a bipartisan priority, even in the midst of the change of administration and things like that. So I think that if I just view this as an American who once upon a time worked to mobilize Americans to support a strong US-UN relationship and now works to ensure that the US plays its role in urgent humanitarian priorities, separate from the UN, but very much connected to it, and that the UN plays a regulatory role in the work that we do. I think that what's good about, there's nothing good about a country being contaminated with landmines, but the only thing that is helpful about this challenge versus others is it's specific and defined. Once you've cleared that field, the farmer goes back. It's not a commitment that goes on for decades and decades for that farmer. They're back in their field. They're funding Ukraine's own war. They are feeding the rest of the world. It makes sense in a public context in the United States, but we need to keep reminding Americans of that. And we spend a lot of time engaging Congress to remind them of that, in part because we care about Ukraine's recovery broadly, not just our little part of it. But telling the story of our little part of it, I think, helps mobilize others to understand and commit themselves to the broader recovery challenges of Ukraine.
Thank you.
So I want to open it up to the audience right now if there's any questions for any of the panelists.
I have a slightly two-part question, mostly for Chris, mostly, but not necessarily exclusively. Are there resources available for, as you say, kitchen table type data on what getting this done quickly would do as an American with Ukrainian roots, specifically for American kitchen tables to try and increase interest and support in America for these causes? And are there any other ways that from outside of Ukraine people could help with either analyzing data or things like that?
Chris, did you get that?
Yeah, I think you were asking about, are there other data points to make those kitchen table arguments for Americans? Great question. And I need more. I had to testify to the House Foreign Affairs Committee a couple of weeks ago, and I, of course, leaned way heavy on the vegetable oil argument because it's somebody else's statistic. I think that we need to do more about connecting the economics of the lost ag production of Ukraine, because there are very specific statistics about the billions that have been lost, and then convert that into kind of better metrics of what it's done to food prices and other things overall in the U.S. They may not lend themselves to the same storytelling as, this is what your Wesson oil cost on February 20th of 2022, and this is what it cost on February 25th. But there are good kitchen table arguments to be made, and we'd love to work with you and anyone who's interested in engaging elected officials around this. We've got a whole team who works on nothing but that. But yeah, there's a lot more work that needs to be done. I think in part it's us echoing those messages and then updating them as we get better data. But I really appreciate your inquiry.
You got a question over here?
My question is to Gabriel. For example, this technology using, without disclosing secret parts, I assume it produces a lot of very detailed images of the landscape. I was wondering if there's like a byproduct you're thinking about in terms of these images becoming a certain archive for possible reconstruction or war crimes registry?
That's a great question. I would like to think that it has some utility beyond the immediate use. I'm sure Halo has dealt with this. I mean, Halo has definitely dealt with this extensively. But yeah, as we look at our the data that's collected on the former front lines and in the liberated areas, we can sort of track the progression of the conflict. So that was the first moment that we realized that there might actually be some historical use to the data that we're collecting. It is very high quality. It's most of the data we collect is 0.3 centimeters per pixel, so 3 millimeters per pixel. You can see a lot of very detailed things. Most of this land has been cleaned up in some respect, at least from the retreating force. The dead have been retrieved, and some mines and explosive ordnance have been recycled. But yeah, honestly, that's a great question. I haven't.
But you do archive these images, correct?
So the data is owned by the operators, so that'd be Halo Trust, Norwegian People's Aid. So it's really actually Chris's domain. We just help with the processing of the imagery. So in terms of dual use helping for agricultural sector, economic reasons, I'd have to defer to them on how they handle this imagery. Of course, it's very private. These are people's lands. This is their livelihood. So we always make, security is a really high concern. So it's never shared externally. It's really up to the demining organizations to determine how to use that in the best way.
Thank you for your presentations. I was wondering if either Chris or Gabriel, if your organizations are focused on identifying and demining naval mines, and what are the challenges with that, or is there an urgency for that?
Jasper, could you read? I heard about 75% of it, but
Yeah,
the specific mines.
If you're working with identifying and demining naval mines, and if there's like an urgency for that in Ukraine.
Yeah, well, we've been asked about that. Now, I'll say we demine some waters, but they tend to be riverbanks, and also when the dam was destroyed by the Russians, we ended up having to do a lot of kind of shallow water demining because it moved thousands of mines from identified minefields. The great organizations like SafePro had helped us identify, and then the water moved them. So we've had to deal with some underwater demining, but in very littoral contexts. So the kind of deep water demining, those are specialized commercial organizations who do that. And it's a military capability more than an NGO capability. But good question. We get that from from shippers and others.
Any other audience questions?
I have a question. May I, or are we out?
You can ask.
Okay. I have a question for Chris. So there's a moral conundrum I see brewing in various circles regarding the anti-personnel landmine ban treaty. There are some countries, specific Baltic nations, that have been advised to, their defense ministers have advised them to remove themselves from the treaty because of the increasing Russian threat. And the U.S., Biden gave the PFM, or he gave anti-personnel mines to Ukraine, not the PFM ones. Yeah. So I'm wondering what you think about the balance between protecting yourself from an aggressor at the moment versus worsening the contamination for generations to come.
It's a great question, and it is a moral conundrum. Halo's a little bit different in that Halo has been focused on advocating for the removal of landmines since our founding. We are first and foremost a doer. We're an organization that is focused on the field-based mission itself. So we were not part of the coalition to create the treaty. We supported it, but we viewed our mission as creating the capacity, hiring locals, creating the capacity to clear in the mine-impacted countries. So it means that we have not joined in, we didn't join in originally in forcefully advocating for the treaty's creation, not because we didn't support its existence or the need for it. It's just we restricted our advocacy to operational concerns. And we are similarly doing the same. The U.S. government funds over half of the landmine clearance around the world. So our first and foremost priority is to ensure that stays the case. And the questions around the morality of the treaty itself or the efficacy of landmines as a defensive device in certain military settings is, an important human rights concern. And there are great organizations who are arguing those points. For us, we have focused narrowly on saying this is in America's interest. We got to stay the leader on this, and we need to stay the course on Ukraine, where the U.S. has invested more in on mine clearance than anywhere else in the world, and where the need's the greatest. So I know that's a wishy-washy answer. It means that Halo has not taken a proactive stance of criticizing the Finns or the Baltic republics for pulling out of the treaty, as recently happened, or the Biden administration's policy. But what we do forcibly say is, regardless of what your posture is on the treaty, if you're backing off on your commitment to meeting the humanitarian need, then then that's the greater crisis that we hope that you will address. And that if we're in a world where NATO member countries feel the need to take the posture that the U.S. government has all along, which is that the U.S. government believes that landmines are needed for the defense of the DMZ and the Korean Peninsula. Finland is saying they need them for their own purposes. Okay, well, that's an important policy question. But if you are considering those things, then you should also be doubling down on your commitment for landmine clearance.
Yep. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, panelists. Great topics and fantastic knowledge. I wanted to ask, the more I hear about what is occurring and the contamination of the soil and the mines being planted and falling from the sky. I want to ask about the sanctions and what have national community. How do they? Because I'm not aware of any, and it seems like such a tragic event to have the mines planted and then dealing with, I'm sure when you blow them up, the contamination, we were talking with Calvin Norman about it, it's grand and it takes decades, right? Or more than decades to restore and to have nutrition in the soil and so on. So have you heard about anything? And its question is open. I'm not sure who can speak on that.
Thanks. I would say that there's been an effort to quantify, monetarily quantify Russia's ecocide, which deals with contamination from ordnance. There's been a quite good effort to quantify in forests both the very sort of prosaic things like how much timber that could have been turned into products, value-added products in Ukrainian mills was lost, but also much more complex algorithms like how much recreational and water quality protection value was lost when a forest burns down. It's like a multi expert cross. They're bringing in experts from all kinds of different scientific fields to try to quantify this and then put numbers to it that theoretically should be slapped down on the table in front of the Russian Federation when we're in a situation in which we can be trying to demand from them remuneration. And of course, politically, you could slap that down on the table right now, and it's certainly published and out there. But the world hasn't cornered Russia yet to a place where... So I at least hope scientists and experts are quantifying it. There's sort of a ticker that's constantly adding the hundreds of billions of dollars of this is just natural damage, not the human cost. But of course, we have to actually force Russia to pay, and that's a different question.
Yeah, one more question. We'll wrap it up.
Just to comment on what Chris said, my name is Patrick Fouché. I'm a landmine clearance expert. So the U.S. transfers in November and December were not from Korea. Therefore, those are all self-destruct landmines, right? So all of the anti-tank mines and all of the anti-personnel mines that were part of the Biden transfers in November and December have self-destruct capabilities, which means that the idea that those will create persistent contamination in Ukraine over time is absent. So that's a very important distinction as compared to the older mines that Ukraine had in its stockpiles that it had not destroyed by the time the war started, that they have used. Most of the mines that the Russians are using do not have self-destruct capabilities. Chris, when it comes to these European NATO countries that are dropping out of the Ottawa Treaty, the question we're going to be asking ourselves as a mine action community is, are you going to follow America's lead and only produce anti-personnel landmines that have self-destruct capabilities, or are you going to go back to producing the older style landmines that the United States stopped producing in 1991, which are the ones you're talking about that are persistent, that can stay in the ground for 100 years and still be activated. So I think it's a nuanced point, but there's new technologies in this weapon, and if we are all kind of committed to making sure that we don't have the continuation of these problems, we can restrict ourselves to using only those kinds of landmines that have the self-destruct capabilities.
It's an excellent point, Patrick, and I'm glad you're in the room. Well done.
Well, I think on that, we will wrap up our discussion for today. Serhiy, thank you for staying up so late. We will let you go to sleep now. All the best. It's 1
Thank
o'clock.
you very much. It was very nice, and I was glad to see you all. And I really enjoyed our conversation, and looking forward for the next meetings.
Thank you. And thank you, Chris. Sorry you
And
two could not join us for a glass of wine here. I'm just going to finish a very quick note. There are many giving opportunities here tonight. I usually don't do this. We're a charity here, the Ukrainian Institute could use donations too. Tonight, I want to emphasize the opportunities to support the work of our panelists and the organizations they're associated with. There's information on Serhi's initiatives here. We have information on HALO, and if we don't have information on some of the other groups you're working with, please circulate it to me, and we're gonna follow up with the video link that we did not show earlier, and also with those opportunities. Please, this is critical work. So grateful to have this amazing group of panelists. Let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Okay, we are adjourned.
Thank you.